think, especially with the Jordan Peterson second wave, I thought it would be a good time to speak with you.
I'm an open book. I'm happy to talk.
Can you tell us a bit about your background and some of the key events in your life that helped to form you and your love for Christ?
Wow. I in 3 years, I don't think anybody's ever asked me that in quite that way. That's really interesting. Well, some of those playing Paul Vander Klay bingo will hit a lot of squares in this. My father was a pastor of what might be described as a racial reconciliation church in Paterson, New Jersey in the 60s and 70s. That was the context in which I grew up. Both of my parents were, well, my mother's still alive, my father's passed, deeply Christian and not satisfied to simply think properly about the faith, but motivated to live out their faith in a very sacrificial way. My father spent the first 36 years of his professional ministerial career serving people in Paterson, New Jersey, people who were pretty much at the bottom of America's socioeconomic pile, people whose names will not be remembered except by those around them who loved them. And so that was, in a lot of ways, probably the most formative witness to Christ, non-biblical witness to Christ I have is my father. And as a child, you don't know what's going on. You have no perspective because it's just your home. And so I grew up with my father very sacrificially serving the people in the first ward of Paterson, New Jersey, and serving them sacrificially with his whole life and his whole body. And if he was always using the church van because somebody needed to move, and then if you had to move something big or awkward, he would, you're his son, you come with me and you help me move this person. And we do that. And kid doesn't necessarily want to do this, but you begin to learn. And week after week, we worshiped with the people. And so that was half of my life. The other half of my life was sort of Dutch Calvinist classic Christian Reformed church, where there was a Christian day school. So the people I went to Christian school with were mostly people of other Christian Reformed churches, but on weekends, and the neighborhood we lived in was transitional or mostly African-American community in, rusty Paterson, New Jersey. That formed me in ways that really I only have perspective on now, decades later. I went on to eventually go to Calvin Theological Seminary. I never really wanted to be a parish minister like my father. I think there's sure plenty of psychological reasons for that. And so instead, the woman that I married very much wanted to be a foreign missionary. So I worked in the Dominican Republic for a number of years. And those years too were deeply formative for me in terms of, I think I went to the Dominican Republic imagining that here I just had a newly minted theological education, and here we have a well-funded mission organization that should be able to help these desperately poor people do what? But it's all sort of foggy. What was our goal with them? A lot of it was just help them survive and live a little better, and have better theology and do church better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Thinking back on it now, I had no idea what on earth I was doing, and I learned far more from them than I'm sure I ever taught them. So, all of that shaped me, and then eventually wound up here in Sacramento, California, in another church that was sort of founded in a similar way to what my father's church was, except urban California was quite different from urban Paterson, in that there are way more cultural groups on the menu. There's not only African Americans, there's Hispanics, and living in Latin America, Hispanic is not one category. It's an enormous multi-ethnic, multicultural context. And then there's Asians, and Asian is not one category. You have Japanese and Chinese and Korean and Hmong and Pacific Islanders. And the community that I landed in Sacramento, Time Magazine in 2003 profiled it as, the most integrated city in America. Well, what does that mean? So not just the most multicultural, but the most integrated. Sacramento sort of managed to create a multiculture here. And it's done fairly well. That's been stressed, obviously, with what's going on in the U.S. right now. But, all of this forced me into asking a lot of deep questions about what on earth is the gospel and what on earth are we doing? And, then add, all kinds of things just in my own life in the 57 years that I've lived. Just always had both very high in openness in terms of, I got this from my father, in terms of learning to love and relate to people who don't necessarily share my culture or my beliefs, but also a certain, I think, holy dissatisfaction with a lot of the all too easy answers that deal with this world's continual brokenness, and the brokenness in me. I talk on my channel and people dismiss me when I talk this way, but I'm serious about it, about, all of the failures in my professional life. I mean, I wasn't a successful missionary. I haven't been a successful pastor in terms of my local church. I inherited a church that was sort of already on the downside. My unwillingness to play ball with some things that had been happening at the church for a few decades caused an exodus at the church a few months after I got here. I was just a neophyte. I didn't even know what all was going on. But, we've done credible ministry here of trying to love each other and trying to serve the community. But the church has continued to die and decline. And I made my peace with that. I tried all sorts of turning the church around type things that were going on in the late 90s, and all with, quite a bit of failure, and eventually settled down to say, whatever it is God is going to do with this place, I am called to love his people and serve them. And we are called to love our neighborhood and serve it. And so whatever happens in this church numerically, this is what we'll do. And let's just settle down to do this. And and that's what we do. Now, I've also, part of my restlessness has been intellectual. And so I would tend to do deep dives into people, read a lot of C.S. Lewis. And in the early aughts, or in the middle of the aughts or late aughts, it was, a lot of Tim Keller. I was very interested in the ministry of Tim Keller. And then in the late teens, 2016, 2017, Jordan Peterson came on, and I began to notice in the culture, and especially in the church, some pretty foundational things starting to turn in terms of what I saw as our definition of the gospel. And obviously that word had been impacted by Tim Keller's work and sort of his neo-Puritan emphasis. But at that point, I was again sort of mining C.S. Lewis, and began to notice that a lot of the issues that I was dealing with intellectually, issues with naturalism and materialism, issues with the fact that, decades before I had come to, people sometimes ask if I use the books behind me. You look at the work of, let's say, someone like Brevard Childs, and on your channel, I can kind of say this, a canonical approach to scripture, where sort of at the end of modernity, realizing, hey, yeah, we can dice and slice this book all we want and talk about, documentary hypothesis and form criticism, and we can do all of this stuff, but in the end, it's a book. And the book has to be dealt with as it is together in the life of the community of faith. And so, then in terms of Genesis and science, I decided it's, people here on Sunday morning, especially in a place like this with the people here, they don't need some highfalutin treatment of science and the Bible when I'm preaching on Genesis. They want to know what's in Genesis. And so I'm just simply going to preach what's in the book. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily resolve the question. Everyone in their minds is sitting there thinking we're on a globe going around the sun. And when I open up the book of Genesis, we're sort of on a table with a dome over us with, you know, the heavenly palace and then sort of the temple down below that's connected. And that's where I was, sort of working through C.S. Lewis's Miracles book over and over and over again, trying to, how can these two worlds come together and how can we talk about them? And then of course, Jordan Peterson shows up, and I didn't exactly know what on earth was going on with that business, but I knew stuff was going on. And then I noticed that all kinds of people that had long given up on Christianity were listening to him. And I thought, what's that about? Because, you described a little bit some of your path. I had seen people go down the road towards playing with Eastern religions or atheism or just leaving the church for common, secularism. That was pretty much a one-way street. And I began noticing, because of Jordan Peterson, people coming back down that street. It's like, hey, wait a minute. I haven't seen this before. What's this guy doing? And the more I look at the guy, I realize he's not doing anything like any of the church growth people that I read in the late 90s. He's not really doing anything quite like Tim Keller. What's he doing? So then my question is, I want to figure out what he's doing. And if I can rip him off a little bit, I'm going to try, because I don't got much going on with me. So that started that thing. And that, I paid attention that he was on YouTube because I was reading Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And, thinking there's something about YouTube with this. It's not, I didn't find Jordan Peterson on YouTube. And then when I did, I started digesting YouTube videos, and I'd never done that before. I didn't really understand what YouTube was. I'd used it as a video utility. But then why is it that I can sit and listen to this guy for 2 hours ramble about the Bible? And others can too. So, and then people started finding me and talking to me, and it's been 3 years, and I sort of, I released a 4-hour video this morning, which in some ways is really insane. But in my defense, I try to explain what I do with these crazy videos, which is I basically just think out loud. It's not a polished show. It's sort of what I learned to do with my blog in the middle of the aughts, where I said, I'm just going to put stuff out there. And, with my blog, a few dozen people found it helpful. And so I put a YouTube video out there thinking a few dozen people will find this helpful. And that's what I do. But then a few thousand people found it helpful. And it was like, oh, okay. And that's where I'm at.
Yeah, thank God for it, Paul. And what you said there made me remember about whenever I was telling part of my story. A big thing that I didn't say, which I probably should have said because it makes all the difference, is that going beyond. So obviously, whenever I first became interested in the Christian story, to actually cross over, you had to go beyond just understanding that the Christian conception through iconography and things like that God reveals himself through the creation. Obviously, that's one of many competing visions, and it can't bind you coherently unless it's genuinely true and revealed from outside the system, as it were. This is something I'm trying to understand. So Jordan Peterson, people like that, would have maybe helped me, but you could never fake it. You could never. Another way, Jonathan Pageau talks about going to church, and I remember how uncomfortable I was going to church when I didn't believe in the Christian story. And I can sort of sympathize with people. And that's why I find people like Douglas Murray so interesting, because he clearly sort of wants to be Christian, but he can't, or he thinks that he can't. Obviously, he can. There is a certain fatalism, which
you say obviously he can. It's not obvious to him.
It's not obvious to him, but that fatalism. I know I'm looking at it from the other side now, but I would have been in the same position. Would have thought you could never fake this or anything. So I should give big props to N.T. Wright, because I had to wrestle with it historically, and why this versus Islam, why this versus modern secularism, and I had to interrogate epistemology. Sorry to go off on a philosophical tangent, but I had to question the epistemological assumptions of modern secularism, and why is that more rational and self-evident than any of these other myths and so on. And I came to the conclusion that it is, I think, in line with what you've been saying recently, it is a form of Gnosticism where you assume this disembodied reason that can scan all of history, and there's this built-in notion of its self-evidency and everything. And then I've seen this in teaching ones in school, how they are brought up to assume these things are self-evident and neutral. They assume the modern state school is neutral, and I have to sort of disavow them of these beliefs sometimes. I can't help myself, because that's one thing I think. With my channel, I want people who can break through to then see how it changes everything. And as you hinted about the resurrection video, I think people like N.T. Wright have been a great help, and I think I should have mentioned him. And obviously he had the courtesy to come on my channel when it was still so small. As you say, it's small now, but God, it was tiny at that time. And Tom came, and he's emailed me different times, and I've asked him these niggling questions and email, and he's always very forthcoming. And yeah, so I want to give big shout out to
I'll
Tom.
have to treat you like Pageau. Can you get NT Wright on my channel?
I'd love you to do one with Tom. Actually, I would say he would do it, no problem. And there was somebody else I was thinking you should do.
I'm a big fan of NT Wright. I have been for a long. I've got a ton of his books.
Yeah, so I've seen.
And actually his. So before I had a crush on Tim Keller, I had a crush on NT Wright, and his the Old Testament and the People of God. I started reading that book, and the first part of that book where he gets into what is a story. I start reading this book, and it's it's a major book, and it's his more academic stuff, but I read that book and I was hooked. I liked that book. So,
yeah.
and I've never, like I said, I don't tend to chase down big names for my channel, but I'd make an exception for Tom Wright. I would. And the only problem is that, he's a tremendously generous and gracious guy, but you don't have any idea who I am and what I'm doing. And that tends to diminish the capacity for the conversation, because again, part of what I've done with my channel is, and I can't build, it's just so frustrating in this, until we've been there 10,000 years bright shining at the sun, we don't have enough time to really dig deep and to go into deep relationship with that many people. We've got this Dunbar number, but I have tried in my channel to, there's certain repeat offenders who come on my channel because for the conversation to get more helpful, we have to be able to push each other into other places. And that's where John Vervaeke for me has been so helpful, because here's a non-theist, and he's a substantial thinker, and he's better read than I am, and he's really smart. And so, he pushes me, and but he also takes pushing, and he doesn't play status games. So anyway.
Yeah, even people like Bart Ehrman, like well, the one I find the most ridiculous is the kind of Jesus mythologist. I don't think that's a coherent kind of view. I think, but, I don't know. That's I think where you are more open to these conversations than me. People like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or anything, I don't find interesting, or they clearly haven't taken things like philosophy seriously. Unfortunately, they just assume it's one of those things that Tom Sowell talks about, where intellectuals assume that they can speak from the pulpit in all these different areas when they should really stick to their own. I mean, I said that it might sound like a contradiction to what I'm doing on my channel, but I don't think it is. I think you have to identify that core competency, but then, like Jordan does, whenever you get to a certain level, you can look across and be humble about it. And then obviously part of Jordan's appeal is the fact that he's questioning. He's not assuming, oh, I know this, I know this, I know this,
Yeah.
which I think is important. Sorry to go off on that tangent there.
No, it was good. I liked it.
This is why I write the questions in advance, because otherwise I just go.
Oh, it's my desire to get you off on a tangent. Trust me, it is. My ADHD is, I try to infect others with it.
I want to ask you back to yourself then, Paul. So one thing that I've been really interested in whenever I became a Christian is the domestic church, as they call it, and the vocation of marriage, and how God works through marriages and through our children and things like that. I want to ask you about your own experience with that, and how has God worked through your wife and your children for you?
Boy, that's something I don't talk about much, and there's reasons for that.
Yeah.
Partly because it's almost a trope that pastors use their families almost pornographically from the pulpit, for better or for worse. And so I actually don't talk about this much because I'm, just because I do want to honor my wife and my children. And they're, when I started doing YouTube, they didn't volunteer for this. And so their stories are their stories. I'm not saying this to evade the question. I'm going to get to it, but I want to say that as a disclaimer, for the lack of detail that I will give in terms of the specifics of, my wife's story and my children's stories.
Mm.
But no, in terms of my, gosh, this is so hard to talk about. There are a few things that have been more formative in me over the last 32 years than 33 years this year than my marriage. Obviously, a marriage is a big thing. In marriage and parenting, there's sort of a natural and sometimes proper tyranny. And tyrannies are funny things because God can use them. Now, some marriages are easy and some marriages are not. I'll say that. I'd say probably the vast majority of marriages are not. I think there are few areas in which we have as much potential for practical sanctification as we have in our family life. And nothing can humble you or even just act as, well, so if you read in the Gospel of John, a big part of the mission of the Holy Spirit is to show us our sin. That's something that in some Pentecostal churches seems to have evaded them in their enthusiasm for the Holy Spirit, because I found very few people who are terribly enthusiastic about having their sins exposed. And part of, when I use this really shorthand definition of Christianity, of what it means to be a Christian. A Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. And part of how that intersects with this is if we, in fact, are lovers of people and lovers of our spouses and lovers of our children, there are a few things that will test us as much as these kinds of things. And so what this means is that the family is a place where God can test us in ways he can't test us other places. And that's not just true in terms of being a father of a family. It's also true in terms of, let's say, if you're the child of an alcoholic. I had two excellent parents, and there's something that I didn't earn. And it's something that I have a tremendous amount of benefit from. But these familial relationships are deep, deep, deep. And what that means is that if we can pay attention to how Christ works through them, these are some of the most important formative areas of our life. And so for me, that's certainly been the case. I've had a lot of idols that I have had to confront in myself because I'm not always the father or the husband that I should be. And there's in our culture, in American culture right now, there's a deep dissatisfaction with people who are moralists, self-righteous, pushing their morality on others. A generation ago, those were the Christians. Today, they're often not Christians, but they're deeply self-righteous and they're deeply moralistic. And if there's something people don't like, it's that. And so I think if you want to be an effective evangelist, all of the arguments that you bring, the philosophical arguments, all of those things are of far less value than trying to get a handle on your own self-righteousness and your own self-salvationism. And that's something that you can learn in a family, because family stuff is real. It's so real you can't escape it. And so, yeah, I'd say that some of the things that I've learned through my marriage and through being a father are probably some of the most important stuff I've learned about Christianity. And I almost never talk about them because to go into the stories would mean I got to tell stories about my family. And I don't want to produce that kind of pornography.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that part there, Paul. I appreciate it. And I think tying it together with my background and coming to Christian faith and interest in philosophy and things like that, I think what you say is important, obviously for many reasons, but another one is I think the modern conception of human beings as primarily rational is so laughable. If you look at it like that, and you look about a born free but everywhere in chains, this Rousseauian idea, and then you look at a newborn baby. Come on, what planet are you living on? And I think that's something that I've discovered after becoming Christian through reading people like René Girard and Mircea Eliade, and noticing how religious people are and have been throughout history. We're primarily a religious creature, and then that attracted me to Father Alexander Schmemann and people like that. But I think that's another one of the things that your channel is helping us with. So breaking apart this secular sacred distinction and the kind of the bias towards a purely materialist conception of the cosmos and everything. And I think people, it's interesting because you have to make the philosophical move to see that people aren't primarily rational, which the likes of Sam Harris won't make. because they're too tied to this ultimate value that they've set. But then again, going back to Pageau and people like that, that ultimate value is a kind of religious conception itself. And you can't lift yourself up by your kind of epistemological bootstraps or something. You know what I mean? It seems ridiculous to me. But I think, yeah. So what you're saying there is important for someone like me to get to grips with. And then I think because so few people are called to the vocation of celibacy, the fact that it's been prioritized so much in Christian tradition, which I think is a major problem, which is obviously for Catholics and Orthodox, I think is in some ways more of an issue. And then you study the history. So I'm not just targeting secularists. You have to be self-critical and critical of your own traditions and everything too, while staying true to the Lord and the church as it plays out through history. But so some of my conversations, like Father Andrew Lau, they spoke with, and he would tell me about the influence of Plotinus and people like that on the first Christians. But whenever I became Christian and started getting into Orthodoxy, you get these online Orthodox people that want to go back to the pristine early church. And I'm sure you see that in Protestantism too. Oh, yeah. And it's this disembodied ahistorical conception of reality, which I think obviously affects people's secularists in some way, in some cases, and people in the church itself. So I think family and loving people practically in embodied ways helps us to break out of that, and line with what you're saying. And so I have, thank God, by his grace, broke free from some of those things to an extent, through studying philosophy, and tied to that through then incarnating those Christian principles in my life with my even fiance. I'm not married yet, but God willing, I'll be married now in August. And
congratulations!
Thanks very much. Sorry, there's another tangent. So I want to ask you, Paul, about your the feedback that you've received for this kind of online ministry. And I guess from people online would be number one. Number two, from those who are more intimate to you, and what do they think of evangelizing in this sort of space?
So, as I said earlier, in some ways, I've been dramatically unsuccessful in my professional ministerial career. I've never been on the cover of Christianity Today. I don't pastor a mega church with 1,000 or a 5,000 seat auditorium. I don't do any of those things. But over the last few years, there have been people who have, what language to use, become Christians, come to Christ, join church, these things. And I've been a part of that. And I can say that because that's what they've said to me. And I don't know if there's a greater compliment that someone can give me. Just, in fact, I got an email from somebody today who said, you were a big part of me becoming a Christian. And this is a person that I've never met. So it's been mediated by this crazy YouTube thing. I got into this because I wanted to have better conversations. And if you look at, especially my randos videos where I'm just talking to people who want to have a conversation, I'm all nosy. I want to know about their life. I want to know about their faith. I want to know what makes them tick. And for me, a lot of that is I'm just gathering data. I want to know why people tick. I want to know, and then I want to know. I want to know what helps, and to use the Vervaeke term, which I really like, this reciprocal broadening in their life, the reciprocal broadening of their agency, because churches have for a long time, well, they might talk about, okay, becoming a Christian. Well, that's a fine way to say it. And then they might talk about new life or abundant life. And I think, well, that's a little better way to say it. That'll communicate outside of sort of the tribalistic numbers game that we play. But I want to know I want to know about the joy that you found. And I don't mean happiness, I mean joy. And so that's exciting. But what's also deeply rewarding is to be able to intersect pastorally with people and to to help them. And that's also frustrating in the internet space, because I get more requests than I can fulfill, and I have to figure out how to vet those and decide when and where. And I would rather, and as a pastor of a small local church, it's easier because so few people come through the door that they're already sort of self-selected. And so you do what you can with the ones and twos, and you sit around waiting for more a lot of the time. But now with the internet world, no, there's more than I can do. So then the question is, okay, can I build structures that multiply my mission beyond my own bottleneck? So a lot of the feedback I get from people is positive. But I also understand that that's on the other side of a filter. And if all I have to do is look at my YouTube analytics to see what percentage of people stop watching my video in the first minute. And so anything I say after that first minute, and especially if the thumbnail and title are better, and you can see that on your channel too, I'm sure. Certain names, whoosh, people will watch it, but then whoop, they're out within a minute. So negative feedback is not always easy to handle, but as the book of Proverbs says, it's vitally important. And even if, some of the most honest negative feedback is not given with any love or charity. And a lot of that usually expresses what's on their side of the fence anyway. And so I get that. But the response to my videos has been far beyond what I would have expected or imagined, positively. But my goal with that, my challenge with that is to say, okay, so you liked what I'm doing. What can we do so that, okay, someone found Paul Vander Klay, and here's a Christian pastor that they can already sort of connect with. I've always had a need to talk about important things, but I've never had a place, and I drive by church, and church is the last place I would ever do that. And so, okay, so Paul Vander Klay is a minister that I could actually even just try to have a conversation with. Okay, but there's only one Paul Vander Klay. I want to see pastors and churches be places where, just like today, someone will maybe knock on my door because they need a couple of bucks for bus fare, or they need to fill their tank at the gas station across the street, or they need a little food. People will go to churches looking for that kind of help because they know it'll come. I want churches to be the kind of place where someone will think, I've got a lot of questions about the most basic, meaningful topics in the world. A church is a place I can go that I can wrestle with these questions, and I won't feel manipulated, or they're not going to slam me with their product. I'd like churches to be more of that, because when, if I have a question about something and you seem to be someone that can help me with my question, I probably want a little help with my question, but it's still my question. I don't want you to take the question from me, slide in your solution, and give it back to me. That's not honoring me. That's not respecting me. So the feedback I get is, oh, you seem to be wanting to talk to people about their life. And even if they don't become a Christian, you have a care for their welfare and their joy and respect as their person. I didn't expect that from a Christian. When we hear that as Christians, we should recognize our problem.
Yeah, obviously that's something I need to to learn. Just sitting slagging people off here, their worldviews and everything. Yeah, you do have to be humble, and obviously for someone like me who's come from that perspective, I would never have seen it. It's like Alan Watts used to talk about. You have this map of Kansas and the folly of prolonging that map. Whenever it reaches its end, you unless you go into the terrain, you would never know that the Rocky Mountains would be there, and the map would be um, inefficient to cover that terrain and everything. So I think that's something I need to learn, to be more humble and tolerant of people, to be honest. But so kudos to you for putting yourself out there and meeting people where they are. And obviously, as you say, not trying to sell them a product. You're showing them love, even in the art of conversation itself. And that's something I want to talk to you about later, actually, about this dialogos and the actual theological import of the being of the conversation itself. I think that there is a theological.
Well, before we get there, I just want to make one note, because I actually thought about this when I was in college. Because when I went to college, I started reading the Bible for the first time, sort of with a I can take it or leave it kind of thing. And the thing that struck me about Jesus in the Gospels was, if Jesus had been a 20th century evangelical, I would expect Jesus in all of his interactions with people to stop and say, "You need to have a personal relationship with me or you're going to hell." He never says that.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, so if he's the example, maybe I should learn from Jesus about how to treat people. And Jesus can be rough. I mean, don't get me wrong. Jesus isn't nice. Jesus is good, but that's back to that point that if we actually learn from Jesus, if we look at the conversations he's had, the conversations that are recorded, maybe we should talk to people the way he talks to people. So anyway, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have interrupted. Keep going.
No, that's right, Paul. Thank you. And I think the difficulty for me is, this is the problem I have. You've read Dominion and things like that, so you'd know better than me. But from watching videos with people like Tom Holland, there doesn't seem to be a stopping point. So the Christian Revolution, yes, but there's no conception of, say, the Antichrist or anything. That's one of the things I value about Jonathan, and his emphasis on whenever we deify inclusion, say, and non-judgment and things like that. That does seem to be a perversion of the Christian faith. And someone that really impressed upon me has been Ivan Illich. So Cayley, who we spoke about on Twitter recently, David Cayley's series with Ivan Illich, that blew me away. The Corruption of Christianity. I've listened to it so many times. And where do we get that balance between meeting people where they are, and then when does it become that Antichrist? When does that Antichrist element come in, if that makes sense? That's what I struggle with in these sort of conversations.
Well, and I don't know that the question is, when does it come in? I think the question is, when do I need to bring it into the conversation? Because from a conversational point of view, that's the question I have to answer, because it's always there. And that's right, because you have the antithesis, which is Christ Antichrist, and then you have, sort of common grace. And you can't lose both of those things. And we all have both of those things. Even people who are universalists and they're high in openness, the one thing that they can't stand is an antithetical. Well, there they have an antithetical. I mean, it is always there in reality. And so then in the conversation, at some point you have to figure out, okay, where does the antithetical come to play here? And it will always come somewhere. So no, that's a really good point that you make.
I think something that you and others have helped me see too is how this new woke ideology sweeps in and takes over that desire to kind of, I guess in psychology they talk about disgust and things like that. You have to have this domain where you separate yourself from people. You see the woke kind of evangelicals disgusted by their scapegoats and things like that. I think that's why Girard again is so interesting. And does it go back to that understanding of history again, that we are religious creatures and we have to in Christ find a proper place to put that, so that the hierarchies in its proper order? And is it just going to come back in a deformed way? And I guess that plays out at the individual level and then the societal level too.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where Pageau is so good, because he has a way of talking that sort of lays it out, that these recurring elements and patterns are simply inescapable. There will always be an antithetical nature if you are going to be an agent. And Peterson says this sometimes in his own different ways. To choose is to exclude. And people like, I choose everything. Oh, okay. But you can't actually act that out because you're a limited human being. You can't see everything. You can't do everything. You can't choose everything. And so what you actually do excludes what you're not doing. It can be no other way. That's just a function of how we are.
Yeah, I actually read a really interesting book about that recently, why liberalism failed, because it doesn't have a high enough resolution vision of the world and how reality lays itself out. And then you do see these things come back, and then people are like, well-intended liberals are like, what's happening? These are the liberal people, and it's because you don't study history closely enough. And I don't know. I don't want. I feel like I'm being a bit rude towards these people, so maybe need to be careful. So I want to ask you, actually, I was reading Surprised by Joy there the last few days, and I know that you love C.S. Lewis, and I want to ask you about my fellow countryman. Why has he been especially inspirational and influential for you and left this impression?
Yeah, well, my father read us the Chronicles of Narnia when we were little. So my father was colonizing early. And so Lewis, of course, my father loved Lewis, and Lewis's books were always in the house growing up. So there was that. I guess, so he was always sort of Saint C.S. Lewis because of that, growing up. But then later when I found him, of course, Tim Keller is a huge Lewis fan. And so Keller helped, I was a Tolkien fan because I read Tolkien started reading Tolkien when I was in junior high and high school. So via Tim Keller, of course, he reawakened Lewis and Tolkien in me. But then when I guess I can talk a little bit more personally. So in about the mid-aughts, I had really kind of hit bottom in a lot of different areas of my life. And I started, it was really Tim Keller's sermons that, the way people listen to Jordan Peterson's stuff when he first came out, and I did too. That's what I did with Tim Keller sermons, 2, 3, 4 talks a day, hours of Tim Keller every day. I needed that to sort of, get my feet back under me again in a whole lot of areas of my life. And I began to see that, well, gosh, a lot of what Tim was doing was bringing Lewis to me. So then at some point, you don't read as much Tim Keller, you start going directly to Lewis. And so by the middle of the teens, this question of being divided between these two worlds. So when Pageau was talking to Peterson, Pageau named what many of us could see, that Peterson is like a guy with one leg on two things in the water, and they're going like this. And at some point it's like, dude, you got to jump or you're going to just wind up in the waters of chaos. Okay. I mean, it's coming. And, we're very impressed how much split you can do there, Jordan, but your legs get down so low, it's hard to hop. And so in the mid-teens, I was really wrestling with, my own doubts and naturalism, because naturalism, in some ways, especially in the technological secular society we live in, naturalism can make such a strong case. And it was Lewis that, because he had walked that journey, that I could sort of follow him talk about himself. And so it was Lewis that mentored me in a lot of ways. And so I read his book Miracles, many times, and just getting those conceptualizations. And um and then then I started reading a lot of biographies of Lewis and his wife, Joy Davidman, and that opened my eyes to this guy was a complex guy. And the St. Louis that I grew up with, um, there's a real man under those stories, with, kind of the way that he might have, rooked that priest into doing the official marriage to his wife. And, and the relationship that he had with, the mother of his war buddy. And, there's a lot of stuff in there, and you really begin to see this rather strange man, um, who now later via Vervaeke, I see that, here's a guy that loses his mother when he's 6 years old. And his father just doesn't know how to handle and raise two boys. And so he sends them to a boarding school where the headmaster is, certifiable and should be locked up. And, then eventually his salvation goes to this embittered atheist who would probably run circles around Sam Harris in terms of logic and rationality. And of course, someone as naturally brilliant as young Jack, eats that up with a spoon, and wants to have this, academic career, but can't do math. And then there's a war, and then he goes to war. He's not an athlete, and he gets just the right kind of injury to survive the war. And then he finally, becomes a tutor, but never really likes the job. And his, living with the mother of his deceased war buddy. And everybody's like, what kind of weird relationship? And he lies to everyone that this is his mother, even though his mother died, because, a Freudian analyst would look at this with all kinds of lights going off. And, and then meets a weird bird like Tolkien and some of these other guys, and the lights start coming on. And Lewis is just a deeply strange dude in so many ways, but he walks this path and shares it with us. And he'd done this. You read a guy like Sheldon Van Auken's A Severe Mercy, which is just a heart-rending, honest, passionate book. And so Lewis was doing this around him, and it continues to happen. So, no, Lewis has been one of these dead mentors in my life who, I've got my grandfather's copies of some of his books on my shelf here. So he's not only mentored my grandfather, he mentored my father, he's mentored me. And, then when Jordan Peterson came on, it was like, oh, wow, there's Lewis written all over this story. I saw it immediately. And I knew if I was going to go kind of down so I'd always sort of picked Christians as my mentors, Tim Keller, C.S. Lewis, my father. If I was going to do a deep dive in Peterson, I knew I needed a guide. I needed a Virgil who would walk with me through, Dante. And so I thought, I'm going to pick Lewis. Lewis picked, of course, one of his mentors, McDonald's. So that's the journey I've been on, and I've found Lewis to be a super helpful guide. So I still continue to read biographies, reread his books, and find, and he of course leads me to Chesterton and to other places. So no, Lewis is a really gift of God to the English speaking Christian world.
Yeah, amazing. And I remember now. I was saying that, or thinking that you should speak with Lou Marcos, who I had on talking about the resurrection, and Lewis a few times. I think you two would have a really good conversation. You've read different Lewis books than I have. For example, I haven't read Miracles. I've read The Weight of Glory and Surprised by Joy and a few others. But I think that you could go in some different directions, which would be amazing. And I want to ask you next then about Jordan, and what excites you the most about the second Peterson wave?
Here's the thing about Jordan. The guy is a lightning rod. Stuff happens around him. And he's a lightning rod in that it's not much fun to be a lightning rod, because you get how much energy, how much electricity through you seeking the ground. That's Jordan. I'm excited because, well, we'll see what happens in the second wave. The first wave kind of climaxed, right before the book tour, but I think the book tour was part of the recession of the wave, and then the trough was his absence, and now we're seeing the swelling of the second wave. But his conversation with Jonathan Pageau, he's going to have a conversation with John Vervaeke. Where this goes, I don't know. And stuff happened in the first wave, and again, I pay a lot of attention to Peterson, and there will always be the comments on my channel. Oh, you talk more about Jordan Peterson than you talk about Jesus. It's like, well, first of all, I don't think that's probably true. Second of all, go listen to my church channel. Understand, and it sounds terribly ungracious, and I don't want to be ungracious towards him, because I have deep affection for him and an immense amount of gratitude, just circumstantially, what has happened in my life because of him. But I'm less interested in Jordan and far more interested in the people interested in Jordan. And so people are all like, well, Jordan owes you a conversation. I don't think Jordan owes me anything. I'd love to have another conversation with him, but that's not actually so tremendously high on my list, because, same problem with Bishop Barron. Jonathan's and John Vervaeke's conversations with Jordan are actually more interesting to me, because I don't have a relationship with Jordan. John and Jonathan both have relationships with him. So those conversations for me are important, but I'm more interested in what's happening around Jordan than actually with respect to Jordan, because I see, like I said, people coming down what I thought was a one-way street. And it's like, God is doing a new thing. And now, again, I look at Lewis and I think, well, that was sort of happening with Lewis, but 2021 is not, the 30s and 40s. So God is doing a new thing. And orthodoxy is hot. Wow. And, and I think, Protestantism is a protest. It's in the name. And there have been, you read Augustine and you look at the Donatist controversy, and, there've always been, church history has always had these, always had these conflicts. Protestantism is the major conflict of the last 500 years, and it's deeply tied to modernity, deeply tied to all kinds of different things. And I think we might be seeing the beginning of the end of the protest. But that protest changed the Roman Catholic Church deeply and profoundly. And I'm just learning about that. The Orthodox in the West gosh, we have no idea what that's going to do to Western Christianity, and we have no idea what that's going to do to orthodoxy. We are living in exciting times, and ironically, one way of entry into this excitement is this nutty Canadian who wanted to buy a defunct church so he could hold forth to a few hundred people, but now he has millions. I mean, come on, people. This isn't fun. And I look at so many other pastors who just either, oh, I don't trust Jordan Peterson. Oh, okay. Or, and I just think, isn't this, I think this is just, I just feel terrifically happy to have been alive to watch this. And the fact that I get to be a little bit player in it, I'm over the moon. So.
Amazing. And like you said there, even hearing the likes of Thomas's story, this young man brought up atheist in the Netherlands, gone off to university and everything, living a kind of nihilistic lifestyle. Then along comes Jordan, along comes Pageau, who would have seen any of this happening. As what you say, so is it, again, that thing is playing out at these wonderful providential individual levels and across the society. Then obviously there's the other thing that beyond the West, what's happening with the church worldwide and the global South and places like that. My fiance, she's from Zimbabwe, for example. Things happening in Africa. It's exciting, all right. And I know you keep abreast of these things because we've mentioned in tweets and different things like Vinod Ramachandra and people like that who wrote this wonderful article, Scandal of Christ, this nuclear scientist in Sri Lanka and how he came to Christ, and Vishal Mangalwadi, who wrote a similar book to Dominion, how the Bible changed the world.
Yeah.
And he talks about how it's even in his life, they would not look after the girls, the youngest girls who would be unwell, and she was going to die, and the family didn't care. And we think because we've been so kind of penetrated by the gospel that this is just the norm. Again, it's that thing of, we think it's self-evident, but this rests in this foundation that has been coming along in line with what Tom Holland talks about in Dominion. And we sort of have to think back, and thank God Jordan is there to, as Jared Casey said in our discussion, make those questions live again. And like the question of whether there is a God or not, it matters. And I'm glad that your channel has helping people to see that it matters and wrestle with those things rather than just flippantly saying, oh, this is like Iron Age mythology and so on. And so yeah, thank you for that, Paul.
I'm just happy I've had a small part to play in it. That's been fun.
Oh man, I want to ask you about then how do people who tune into Jordan and Pageau and to your channel move from that realm of ideas? Oh, isn't that interesting? And start to form these embodied communities in Christ and live that out.
Well, the fact that they recognize that that's what they're needing. They need community. That's, so part of what, so I watched, I saw what was happening with Jordan, and I'd read the comment sections, or on Reddit, and I noticed, boy, there's a deep hunger for people to talk about this. And so then when we started our local meetup, the first few meetings, people are like, I found Jordan Peterson. I got to talk about him. I tried talking about him to my wife, and my wife looked at me like, we're not going to spend our time talking about this guy. I'm not going to watch those videos. I don't know what I don't know who you need to talk to about this, but it isn't going to be me. And, and then the Jordan Peterson show would come through town, and I would see it all over the place. People, and again, people, how do we think? Well, sometimes when we think, there's this little voice in our head, which is us. Often when we think we're writing or talking, this is how we process things collectively. This is just a deeply human thing to do. And Jordan Peterson was going around, speaking to people's speaking to a meaning crisis that even he didn't have the words to name necessarily. Even he keeps asking, what on earth is going on? But here is the lightning rod, and boy, lightning is striking. And okay, we need each other in order to process this. And so the meetups and the YouTube channel and the conversations were ways to go about it. But, right before I talked to you, I was talking to a young man, and, we had a good conversation, and he's like, well, when can we talk again? I was like, I don't know, because, even though I've just got this little YouTube channel, not a big one like Peterson, it's medium size or small medium. I don't have time to talk to all of these people that often. And so, well, who are you going to talk to? Well, you're going to need to develop a community. And see, this is something that I think my grandparents' generation, who were the children of immigrants, understood that if they emigrated from the Netherlands to the United States, and they understood that they understood what they needed. And a lot of it formed in a church, because some of them were religious, but a lot of immigrants who weren't necessarily terribly religious in the old country started going to the churches in the new country because there were people like them, and they could talk about what they wanted to talk about. And so communities would form. And this has been a big part of the United States, that immigrants come in and they form communities that sort of buffer the trauma of immigration. And those generations understood that together they needed to collectively sacrifice in order to build these institutions that facilitated the communities and all of the stuff that we need communities for in our lives. I think a present generation is so used to inheriting structures that they just always think it will be there. And I think probably in Europe you have this perhaps even more than we do. The church might not be there, because everyone who had been doing all of the giving and volunteering and supporting to build and maintain these institutions, they're dying. And so, part of what I've been trying to do, both with church planting and with the meetups, has been, hey, if you have this need, you're going to have to shoulder some of the work to build a community to meet that need for yourself and for others who you don't even know yet. And that requires sacrifice. And modern living has gotten so affluent and comfortable, we no longer understand what sacrifice is for and when it's required. And so for me, at least in the United States, there is enough of an infrastructure around that I can tell people, well, you're probably going to need to find a church. And then they're like, yeah, but I tried visiting some, and gosh, you don't know how bad it is. Yeah, I know it's bad. But let me tell you something about these churches. They can be colonized. And if you show up regularly, and if you start to serve, and if you start to invest, you'd be surprised how much that investment can pay off over the long term. Because what happens in churches is that you start showing up every week, and, oh, well, you're one of us now. And then, oh, let's make you a leader. And suddenly you have influence and say, not completely, in what goes on in this space. And so I try to encourage people, if you're going to need community, you're going to have to work towards building it.
And then, even though it's not perfect, I guess you're talking about a community that has that goal to self-sacrifice at the heart of what it's meant to be about, even if people don't live up to it. Whereas other communities in many cases probably are focused around more selfish gains, or the metrics are different. So it's like, compared to what is it, this kind of utopian conception or something, is it? Or else are you going to find a community that's going to focus on self-sacrifice and calling you to a great adventure, and even at the down to earth level of your husband or wife, loving them like it's only in Christ and taking the gospel seriously that would call you to make those sacrifices and live it out. Whereas if you, I guess, have this philosophical conception that it's just everything's a product of time plus chance and so on, then what ultimate incentive or ultimate meaning is there for you to live like that? I guess, does that make sense?
Yep.
Which,
Well, I
sorry.
think I don't think we can see how our consumerist ethos has formed us
Mm,
and made us so completely mercenary. And so many of the communities we see popping up are around consumer products and the facilities for community. You know, it's sort of like Google. Here's free email. Let's throw all this free stuff at you. Isn't it amazing that it's free? Is it free? And, you know, like they say, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. Oh.
I want to ask you about the challenges of COVID for your church then, Paul, and how Christians should adapt to this new normal we're
Yeah.
undergoing.
So when COVID hit, it was, all panic and, oh, what's this going to be? Well, now we've had a little bit of time and we're starting to gain some perspective. And at least here in the United States, vaccines have gone out. And because many of the people in my church are senior citizens, many of them are getting vaccinated. Now even my children are half vaccinated. And so we'll see if the numbers go down. But I think a lot of churches are starting to wake up to the fact that the nominalism present in their congregations is deeper than they had anticipated. And now you're starting to get a sense of which families are not coming back. And it's not even just that, okay, they will be missed, and all of the things that they brought to church themselves, their time, their energy, their contributions. But what does that say about the fact that they checked out for a year and said, what, what was it? What does that say about your church?
Yeah.
What does that say about your religion? What does that say about your God and your message? I think this is not going to be pretty. And when we went into COVID, I knew that this might be it for my church. And it might still be, but my church is getting weird because of the YouTube online stuff now, because 2,000 people will listen to a rough draft that 50 people will hear the final version of. What does that mean? And that's why lately some of my videos have been talking about platforms, because we haven't done enough theological reflection on what exactly is the church, and how does the church relate to books, to get to the Reformation. How does it relate to YouTube? What is it that, I have some people that say, well, I go to the Orthodox Church on Sunday, but I listen to you 5 days a week. So you have an Orthodox priest who's serving you communion, but there's a Calvinist pastor filling your head with his ideas. What does that mean? So, yeah, COVID, I think, is going to change stuff dramatically around us, and I'm not sure we know how. And some of this stuff we're not going to like.
Mm. I want to ask you, in line with that, then, Paul. So I see a lot of people. I think they strawman which Rod Dreher talks about with the Benedict option. But from my experience in teaching, I'm actually quite favorable to it because of, in line with what I was saying earlier on. I think we are liturgical beings, and we're formed. Our characters are formed by these repeated mantras and everything. And I would teach in secularist schools in London, and it's Earth Day. It's not feasts, saints feasts and things like that in the Catholic Church. It's Earth Day. It's Black History Month. It's LGBTQ stuff, and it's, as you say, 5 days a week. And the ad hours all the time. You're doing sports after school. You get things on Saturdays, and these are young children are being ritually fed these alternate liturgies that aren't Orthodox small o. And from that perspective, I am quite open to some form. I don't know if you'd call it the Benedict option or anything, where obviously you're very high in openness. So I'd love to hear what you say, and you're reaching out to these people. But for me, I think we have to know our own story and then go out and preach the good news. And how do we get that balance again? No, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
So I've lately been reading this book on, reformations, and for me the book has been helpful because my education in the Protestant Reformation was always way too skewed towards the values of my own particular slice of the Protestant Reformation that I was raised in, the Dutch Calvinists. But I think we probably need to continue to take a look at monasticism and how that played out in the history of the church, because it's very interesting. And when you get to, you understand the role that the monasteries played with the collapse of the Roman Empire. Now, even the way we phrase that, the collapse of the Roman Empire, it probably didn't look, Augustine responded to the sack of Rome in 410 AD with his book, The City of God. But, we have this thing called the Holy Roman Empire all through the Middle Ages. And of course, historians have always quipped, it was not holy nor Roman nor an empire, really, because the emperor didn't have much power, on and on and on and on. So you had, throughout the history of the church in the West, this is where you get into platforms, you had churches, and I'm just now starting to get, so you had the secular priests, and when I first heard that I was like, what do you mean the secular clergy? Who are then you have the regular? It's like, well those regulars are over there, and then you have the orders, and then you have all of, you look at the enormous diversity within the Roman Catholic Church in the West and everything going on, and it's like, as a Protestant, I look at this and it's like, wow, this is a lot. There's a lot of important data in here I knew very little or nothing about. And then you get to the time of the Protestant Reformation, and these monasteries are corrupt. Everyone agrees with it. These monasteries have, they're in the people have, all of the monks took vows of poverty, but the monastery itself is brimming with gold because everybody was impressed at the serious cruciform life of the monks, and so they threw money at it. And, well, what are we going to do with this money? Well, let's put it in the altar, and let's put it, and so you get to the time, you get to Luther's time, and Luther's been an Augustinian monk, and he's like, nobody attacks the monastics more than him. And so now I'm reading in this book, and so a huge part of the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic Church was to address corruption in the monasteries. But what that did was, ironically, multiply the number of orders. So not only did you have some reformation of existing orders, but you had a lot of new orders that were designed because the old orders were corrupt. And so then you see that, and it's like, wow, this is just exploding. But then you realize that still the landscape is dotted with all of these regular churches, and you've got questions about the mass, and and just looking back in history, it's this enormously complex thing. And so I look at Rod Dreher's work, and part of me looks at it and says, yeah, he's talking about the Christian Reformed Church from about 1870 to 1940. The Christian Reformed Church lived the Benedict option in a way, but in a Protestant way. And then we took the walls down after the war. And so on one hand, a lot of the estuary talk that I do is because the church is too insular. Well, monasteries are insular, but they are and they aren't, because some of them also serve the neighborhood. Then you look at, let's say, so I'm just reading about the Jesuits, and the Jesuits are this weird kind of monastic order that don't really have a rule, but they have all these practices by which they're initiated, and then they go and build schools, and it's like, and so I look at that history and I think, yeah, the Benedict option, it's going to happen. We're going to see in this period, we're probably going to see again another multiplication of, will they be orders? What will they be? But not unlike late antiquity, when everything is on the menu. You know where people go when everything is on the menu, and they've been stuffing themselves at the buffet trough? They look to fasting and to poverty and to self-denial. And that's where they find faith. That's where they find the fullness of life. But now, I mean, there's sort of a cycle that we go through with this, but that's, I think, part of where we're at in the cycle. And we're going to see new monastics. In late antiquity, the new hot thing was virginity, was celibacy, was abstinence, and wealthy families who had daughters that were promised from a very young age to high status, wealthy other families were horrified because these daughters would become teenagers, and instead of reading Tumblr to become bi, they listened to each other and went into a monastery. And for the families, they're like, you've just destroyed our multi-generational plan of status and power and success. It's St. Francis all over the place again. And this has happened again and again and again. And will it keep happening? I think so.
Amazing. I think too, well, I hope in some ways, and think that the Spirit is moving in a way that will bring greater light to the vocation of marriage, for example. And that seems to be something that's happening in the Catholic Church, which I think is a genuine growth in the church and not some sort of innovation that is a fall away from a pristine church. I think the greater awareness since Vatican II in the Catholic Church, especially of marriage and focus on that, is a good thing. And especially as those fault lines are drawn with transgenderism and things like that in relation to secularism and the dominant secularist culture, that might offer an opportunity for us to appreciate God more in that realm. That'll be one thing. And then that's what I hope for. And I want to work along those lines with my new job and bring married Christian people together to talk about how God's working through their families and so on. And I think too, from my experience in teaching, that you probably know about this in your country, the shift to things like classical education, which I'm not going to say either of these things are panacea or anything. And as you rightly say, history is so complicated and it's kind of foolish to make these assumptions sometimes. But I think there will be a well-formed education for many people, like homeschooling, or whether they form cooperatives, come together, which I would like to see that in Ireland, because I've seen the schools the way they are in Britain, and we mimic Britain. So we're maybe 5 years behind, and I know where it's going from working in London. And I hope that we do something like that here. The bad thing is that there's more of an entrepreneurial spirit and so on in America, where people are willing to try new things, whereas we're a bit more, we're not as inclined to do that here, unfortunately. But yeah, that would be amazing. When I talk about the Benedict option, that's what I'm referring to, if that makes sense. And yeah, I want to ask you next, Paul, about some of the misconceptions that you've come into about Christians and Christian beliefs online. And I love the way you talk about the super thing. And what are some of the key problems in getting stuck with these low resolution conceptions of the spiritual life, either for from our Christian perspective or against our people who are critiquing the church?
Well, all of us having low resolution takes on what is unfamiliar to us is it's not a bug, it's a function of humanity. We need low resolution takes on things because we don't have time to do everything or know everything or be everything or try everything. So yeah, we can't see the really big things that are really close to us. You know, if you go to Yosemite Valley, Yosemite National Park is this major world attraction that's about 3.5 hours away from my house, and it's a national park, and it's just, you have El Capitan, Half Dome, and these are things that are known around the world, and tourists from around the world go there. If you're really close to El Capitan, all you see is a wall of granite. You have to be a ways away to sort of appreciate what that big hunk of rock is. So much of, I think, evangelism is trying to find ways to afford perspective on the true. It has to be about the true, because if you just give an insight, and if you're actually successful in delivering this insight, they go and do more research and discover you're wrong, you've just undermined your own effort. So yeah, if you look at I like to look at Charles Colson in this. So Charles Colson wrote this book. He was a top aide for Richard Nixon. He was Richard Nixon's hatchet man, who did all sorts of dirty deeds for Richard Nixon, the president of the United States, who resigned. And he was a true believer in Nixon, which is why he would do this dirt for him. And he's increasingly becoming aware that Nixon, Chuck Colson is sacrificing himself for Nixon. Nixon won't sacrifice himself for him. His idol is foundationally corrupt. And he's at that time becoming influenced by a group of evangelical born-again Christians there in Washington, D.C. And so one day he kind of, he comes home and says, "Honey, I'm a Christian." And she's like, "I thought we were Episcopalian." and so, well, okay, so what was happening in Chuck Colson's life? And he writes about it in his book, Born Again. It's a lovely biography, but I'm old enough to remember the 1970s. That was, I'm going to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Well, in order to do that, Jesus Christ is a very agentic person. I'm going to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That forms what we think of as God. And, 30 years later, Sam Harris is on stage poking holes at this thing that people are having personal relationships with, and poking holes at their personal relationships and mocking that. And Jordan Peterson comes along, and he doesn't seem to be on the program. And so finally, there's a big showdown. Jordan, what is this God you're talking about? And Jordan lists a bunch of things. And Sam is like, that's not God. God is these things. And I looked at Jordan's list, and because, my tradition has been embalming and preserving things from the 16th century, which sort of still had in them a lot of late medieval language and conceptualizations before the really modern period, I could listen to Jordan's list and say, yeah, that's God. But that's a God of providence who brings fat years and lean years. And then when I talk to Pentecostals in the 20th century, they say, God only brings good things in my life. And their idea of good things are what they think are as good. And, I talked earlier about marriage and family. As a pastor, a lot of things come into your life in marriage and family that are not good and no fun. Children get sick. People get divorced. Affairs happen. Did God bring that into my life? What is that? And then you start reading the Bible. God sends an angel of death to kill the firstborn of Egypt. Well, and then we try to do theology of this. And so, but then when you talk to people who have these low resolution views, they've just been listening to Sam Harris.
Mm-hmm. And
they're listening to Jordan Peterson, and they don't know well, he said all these weird things, but all they see is a very low resolution view of they somehow became inclined to Jordan Peterson for one reason or another, and now are against Sam Harris. And so they're on Jordan's side, but they have no idea what he's saying. Well, he's actually talking about some things, some older conceptualizations of God that are in the Bible. And in fact, the Jews understood that. But if you show up in a local church, you'll only get this God number two. And there's a real problem with that. And we've seen how that problem manifests itself. So it's absolutely wonderful in Chuck Colson's life that he began a living relationship with a living God. And I mean, it completely transformed his life. He wound up going to jail for Richard Nixon. But while he was in jail, he built relationships with other prisoners and devoted the rest of his life to prison reform and prison ministry, because he began to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Well, that's absolutely terrific. But 30 years later, just that one aspect in isolation becomes something that Sam Harris can use as sort of a cheap target. And, quality people like Bishop Barron and others had sat down with Sam Harris and said, this thing that you're poking at in terms of that you're defining God, that's not really what Christian tradition has said God is. But that you got the no true Scotsman argument, and Sam Harris, quite rightfully so, yes, says, but whole lot of people going to these churches, that's what they're pointing to. So then in conversation with people, once you learn your way around these issues enough, then as a pastor, you learn little stories or little things to point people to that say, hey, what about this? What about that angel of death? Is that God? And again, the point isn't to deliver an answer. The point is to raise the dissonance, to raise the question, because that is what will stick. And then they'll start looking for answers. And when they start looking for answers, it's not, oh, Paul Vander Klay told me this. It's that I found this. That's credible for me. That's powerful evangelistically, because now it's credible. Whereas Paul Vander Klay can be wrong and often is. So that's part of the reason I do what I do in terms of evangelism.
That's really interesting. I know some people philosophically who make good use of Derrida, in line with what you're saying, and decentering these crude mythologies we have and everything. So it's kind of strange that he's one of the ones that Jordan really took on, because I think it's more so the critical theorists who are a problem. I think you can use people like Derrida in some ways, although he's not perfect either. But I want to ask you next about that common atheism And what's the implicit dualism undergirding much of that, and how then can they begin to have better conversations with theists going forward?
Every common atheist is an individual. And for me, I find the quickest way in is usually the personal, not the theoretical. And I think, whereas it's very appropriate on YouTube to have debates about theory about all sorts of things. That's an absolutely legitimate and worthwhile thing to do on YouTube and in books. But in one-to-one relationship with people, the way in is almost always the quickest way in is the personal, because the theoretical follows the personal. And for a lot of atheists, you know, most atheists are nowhere near as atheistic as they think they are. And most Christians are nowhere near as Christian as they think they are.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is where, you know, there's a whole lot of commonality, because we're all sort of swimming in these waters that have 2,000 years of Christianity pushing against us. And so often it's finding the little salient places that, well, I'm an atheist. Okay, have you thought about this? Well, yeah, but I'm still an atheist. Okay, I can't talk you out of it. I'm not going to try, but have you thought about this? And if you want to talk more about this, I'll share with you what I see there. And I have to wrap this up in a couple minutes, but we, you know, Jonathan Haidt's, you've got the elephant and the rider. And if you want to train the elephant, you change the path. And so every conversation is in some ways longs, every satisfying conversation and successful conversation in some way longs to become a path. And when you become a Christian, what that means is you start to change your path. And that means changing your habits, changing what you do every day, changing how you think. And the cumulative effect of that is what makes a Christian and what makes saints. And so what I try to do is say, I'm just going to try and nudge you over a little bit more. You're walking on this atheist road. You might have been sort of walking down the middle. I'm going to try and push you to the side a little bit. And I'm going to walk next to you, probably just right over here on the side of the atheist Christian line. I'll hug that line a little while, and you hug the Christian line, and let's just walk together for a while. And I'm not going to push you or force you or anything, but I'm just going to talk about what's on my side of the line and some of the things I see on your side of the line. And we'll talk honestly. And I think in the long run, I wouldn't still be a Christian if I didn't think it was better.
Amen. Fair enough. Thank you very much for joining me today, Paul. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.